The temperature in Oymyakon had plummeted to 60 below zero, a cold so absolute it could shatter steel. Margaret had lived her whole life respecting the Siberian ice, but nothing prepared her for the unblinking, frost-covered golden eyes staring back from the snowbank, begging for a life that wasn't hers. To understand the sheer lunacy of Margaret Sullivan's existence, one must understand the Siberian taiga in the dead of January. It is not a place meant for frail bones or slowing hearts. At 74, Margaret was a widow, a retired Canadian wildlife biologist, and the sole inhabitant of a fortified log cabin situated 20 miles outside Oymyakon, widely recognized as the coldest permanently inhabited settlement on Earth. When her husband, Arthur, passed away from a sudden aortic aneurysm 5 years prior, her son Thomas had begged her to return to Toronto. The pristine, brutal silence of the snow was her final connection to Arthur. They had spent 40 years studying apex predators in this unforgiving wilderness. She was not about to leave it for the concrete noise of a city. On a bleak Tuesday afternoon, the sky was the color of bruised iron. The wind howled through the silver birch trees, carrying with it a bite that felt like shattered glass against exposed skin. Margaret had ventured out to gather the last of the chopped firewood from the outer shed. Swaddled in 3 layers of thermal wool, a heavy down parka, and a face mask that crystallized with her breath, she pulled a heavy wooden toboggan behind her, the runners squeaking in protest against the densely packed snow. She was about a quarter mile from her cabin, navigating a treacherous ravine to check a remote weather monitoring station. When she saw it, at first, it appeared to be nothing more than a downed birch trunk, half buried in a fresh snowdrift. But the taiga trains the eye to notice anomalies. The shape was too organic, too rounded. Margaret paused, leaning heavily on her walking stick, her breath pluming in the frigid air. A strange, low whistling sound reached her ears, not the wind, but the ragged, wet rasp of a failing lung. She approached cautiously, her thick boots breaking the crust of the snow. As she cleared the crest of the drift, her heart seized in her chest. Lying on her side was a massive grey wolf. Her coat, which should have been thick and insulating, was matted with ice and dark, frozen blood. The animal's ribcage barely moved. Frost tipped her eyelashes and muzzle, essentially sealing her jaw shut. But it was her eyes that stopped Margaret cold. They were a piercing, vivid amber, and they were fixed directly on the elderly woman. There was no aggression in that gaze, only a profound, desperate exhaustion. Margaret knew the brutal laws of the taiga. Nature was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply indifferent. Her scientific training screamed at her to walk away. A dying predator was unpredictable, and interfering with the natural order was the cardinal sin of wildlife biology. But then, the wolf shifted her weight with an agonizing groan, revealing what she had been guarding. Tucked tightly against the mother's underbelly, buried in the only remaining pocket of warmth, was a cub. The pup was shivering violently, letting out a pitiful, high-pitched whine that tore through Margaret's defenses. The mother had purposefully positioned herself as a windbreak, sacrificing her own body heat to keep the freezing winds off her offspring. "Oh, you poor brave girl," Margaret whispered, her voice muffled by her scarf. She dropped her walking stick. Survival in Siberia relies on calculated decisions, but Margaret's next actions were purely instinctual. She pulled her heavy wooden sled alongside the frozen animal. The immediate challenge was logistical. The mother wolf easily weighed 90 pounds, and Margaret's arthritis flared angrily in her knuckles and knees. She knelt in the snow, murmuring low, soothing words. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to take you to the warmth." The mother wolf let out a weak, rattling growl, a mother's final threat, but she simply lacked the strength to lift her head. Margaret reached out and carefully extracted the cub first. The pup snapped its tiny jaws weakly, confused and terrified, but Margaret quickly bundled it inside her thick wool scarf and tucked it into the breast of her parka. The immediate heat of her own body would start stabilizing the cub's core temperature. Moving the mother was a Herculean task. Margaret had to wedge her snow shovel beneath the wolf's rigid body, using it as a lever. Every muscle in her elderly frame screamed in protest. Her lungs burned with the sub-zero air. She heaved, slipped, fell to her knees, and pulled again. Slowly, agonizingly, she managed to roll the heavy, ice-caked predator onto the wooden toboggan. The journey back to the cabin took 45 minutes. It felt like 10 hours. The wind picked up, creating a whiteout condition that erased the horizon. Margaret navigated by the familiar silhouettes of the pines, her heart hammering dangerously against her ribs. She was risking her own life for a wild beast. If she collapsed out here, both she and the wolves would be dead in an hour. But the memory of Arthur, who had once spent 2 days tracking a wounded lynx just to ease its passing, fueled her steps. When the heavy oak door of her cabin finally loomed out of the swirling white, Margaret practically collapsed against it. She dragged the sled over the threshold, kicking the door shut against the howling storm. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. The wood stove was radiating a fierce, localized heat, making the air feel like a physical wall after the brutal cold. Margaret fell to her knees on the rug, gasping for air, staring at the frozen predator lying on her floorboards. The easy part was over. Now, she had to play God. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the sharp, coppery tang of blood. The sudden shift in temperature from 60 below zero to a balmy 70 degrees was dangerous for a victim of severe hypothermia. Rapid thawing could cause a deadly shock to the system. Margaret's hands shook as she unzipped her parka and gently pulled the cub out. The little creature was lethargic, its eyes half closed, but the shivering had subsided into a steady, rhythmic tremble. She prepared a nest of heavy wool blankets in a deep wicker basket near the stove, far enough away to warm up slowly. Using a large plastic syringe she kept for veterinary emergencies, she mixed warm water, a pinch of sugar, and powdered goat's milk, slowly dripping it onto the pup's tongue. The cub swallowed greedily. "You're going to make it, little one," Margaret murmured, naming the ash-colored pup Ash in her mind. But the mother was a much grimmer reality. Margaret dragged the sled closer to the center of the room, away from the direct heat of the stove. She brought over a basin of lukewarm water, not hot, and several heavy towels. As she began to carefully sponge the ice away from the mother wolf's muzzle and paws, a horrific truth revealed itself. The ice had been masking the true cause of the animal's decline. As the frozen snow melted away from the wolf's right hind leg, Margaret gasped. Clamped viciously around the animal's limb, biting deep into muscle and bone, was a rusted, serrated steel trap. It was an illegal bear trap, modified and illegally laid by poachers. The wolf hadn't frozen simply because of the elements. She had been anchored to the ground. In a desperate bid to save her pup, she must have fought the chain until it snapped from its mooring, dragging the heavy steel trap for miles through the snow until exhaustion and blood loss finally brought her down. Fury ignited in Margaret's chest. The poachers in this region were ruthless, operating under the radar of the underfunded local authorities. "Hold on," Margaret said softly to the unconscious animal. "I have to get this off you." The danger was astronomical. The mother wolf was hovering on the edge of consciousness. If she woke up while Margaret was causing her immense pain, her predatory instincts would take over. Margaret could easily lose a hand, or her life, in the confined space of the cabin. Margaret went to her late husband's tool chest. She retrieved a heavy-duty crowbar, a pair of industrial bolt cutters, and a thick leather bite sleeve she had used years ago when handling aggressive sled dogs. She slipped the sleeve onto her left arm. She knelt beside the wolf. The animal's breathing was shallow and erratic. Margaret wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the jaws of the trap. The spring mechanism was rusted shut, requiring an immense amount of physical force to pry apart. Margaret gritted her teeth, her arms trembling as she threw her entire body weight onto the crowbar. Crack! The rusted spring gave way with a harsh metallic snap. As the jaws of the trap released their pressure, a fresh surge of dark blood pulsed from the wound. Simultaneously, the immense pain jolted the mother wolf back to consciousness. The animal's golden eyes snapped open. A guttural, terrifying snarl erupted from her chest, echoing off the wooden walls. She thrashed wildly, attempting to scramble to her feet, but her mangled leg gave out instantly. She collapsed, panting heavily, but her jaws snapped furiously in the air, her terrifying canines gleaming in the firelight. Margaret froze, holding her breath. She didn't retreat, nor did she advance. She stayed low to the ground, making herself as unthreatening as possible. The wolf's gaze locked onto Margaret. The wild tension in the room was palpable. A single wrong move would result in violence. Then, from the wicker basket near the stove, the mother wolf's ears swiveled instantly. Her aggression faltered, replaced by frantic maternal anxiety. She tried to drag herself toward the basket, leaving a smear of blood on the floorboards, but she was entirely spent. She let out a mournful howl that broke off into a cough. "He's safe," Margaret said, keeping her voice incredibly calm and flat. "He's warm, but you are bleeding to death." Margaret slowly slid a ceramic bowl of fresh water toward the wolf's head. The animal flinched, baring teeth again, but the scent of the water overpowered her fear. She lapped at it frantically. While the wolf was distracted, Margaret had to stop the bleeding. She grabbed a clean towel and a bottle of veterinary wound powder. Knowing she was risking everything, she crawled toward the wolf's hindquarters. The wolf growled a low, rumbling warning, but she did not strike. It was as if she recognized the unspoken truce. "Save my cub, and I will tolerate you." Margaret pressed the towel firmly against the lacerated flesh, applying agonizing pressure. The wolf whimpered, her massive head dropping heavily onto her front paws, her golden eyes watching Margaret with a mixture of agony and cautious intelligence. For 3 hours, Margaret didn't move. She kept the pressure on the wound until the bleeding finally slowed to a sluggish seep. She then carefully packed the laceration with antibiotic powder and wrapped it tightly in gauze and self-adhering bandages. She administered a heavy dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics via an intramuscular injection to the wolf's thigh, praying the dosage was correct for her weight. By midnight, the wind outside had escalated into a full-blown blizzard, rattling the heavy window panes. The cabin was warm, but a thick air of uncertainty hung in the room. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, a loaded tranquilizer rifle resting across her lap, a necessary precaution. The mother wolf lay on a large rug near the center of the room, her eyes open, watching the flames dance in the wood stove. Ash had climbed out of the basket and was now curled up against his mother's nose. The mother gently licked the pup's head, her tail giving a single, weak thump against the floor. Margaret let out a breath she felt she had been holding for hours. She had pulled them from the brink of death, but as she watched the predator's eyes slowly drift toward her, reflecting the firelight in the darkened cabin, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. She had saved a wild apex predator, and she had evidence of violent poachers operating in her territory. As the storm raged outside, burying the cabin under feet of snow, Margaret realized she and the wolves were entirely cut off from the rest of the world. And if the men who set that trap came looking for their valuable pelt, it would just be an old woman and a crippled wolf standing in their way. The following 2 weeks dissolved into a grueling, sleep-deprived blur. The blizzard that had chased Margaret and the wolves into the cabin raged with unyielding fury, burying the structure under snowdrifts so high they eclipsed the lower window panes. Inside, a strange, tense ecosystem formed, governed by the rhythmic crackle of the wood stove and the sharp, medicinal scent of veterinary antibiotics. Margaret named the mother wolf Ghost. It was a fitting moniker for a creature that spent the first 3 days lying unnaturally still on the braided rug. Hovering between life and death, the infection from the rusted bear trap had taken hold, sending Ghost into a dangerous fever. During the darkest hours of those early nights, Margaret would sit on the floor beside the massive animal, a bowl of cold water at her side. She used a damp cloth to meticulously wipe down the wolf's snout, ears, and paw pads, desperately trying to lower her core temperature. It was during these intimate, terrifying hours that the line between human and wild predator began to blur. Arthur, Margaret's late husband, had always warned her about anthropomorphizing wildlife. "They don't love Margaret," he would say, adjusting his glasses over field notes. "They calculate. They survive. Respect the instinct, but never trust it." Yet, as Margaret sat pressing a cold compress to Ghost's forehead, the wolf's golden eyes would track her every movement. There was no calculation in that gaze, only a deep, exhausted vulnerability. Whenever Margaret moved to change the heavy, blood-soaked bandages on the mangled hind leg, Ghost would tense, her lips pulling back to reveal terrifying, bone-crushing canines. A low, rumbling growl would vibrate through the floorboards, but she never snapped. She never struck. She would simply hold Margaret's gaze, her muscles twitching in agony, and endure it. It was a fragile, unspoken pact forged in blood and warmth. The pup, Ash, became the crucial bridge between them. Unburdened by the trauma of the trap, the 10-week-old cub quickly rebounded. He was a ball of boundless, clumsy energy. By the 5th day, he was actively exploring the cabin, chewing on the legs of the oak dining chairs and tumbling over his own oversized paws. He found endless fascination in Margaret's thick woolen slippers frequently ambushing her feet as she carried firewood from the indoor pile to the stove. Whenever Ash interacted with Margaret, Ghost would watch with a hawkish intensity. If Margaret laughed, a dry, raspy sound that hadn't echoed in the cabin since Arthur's passing, and gently tossed a rolled-up sock for the pup to chase, the tension in Ghost's massive shoulders would incrementally loosen. The mother wolf was learning, through the safety of her offspring, that the two-legged creature meant them no harm. By the 10th day, the fever finally broke. Margaret depleted her own stores of venison and canned corned beef, feeding the wolf small, frequent meals to rebuild her strength. But the reality of Ghost's injury became starkly apparent. When the wolf finally attempted to stand, her right hind leg hung uselessly. The heavy steel jaws of the trap had shattered the tibia and caused severe nerve damage. She couldn't bear any weight on it, forcing her to hobble painfully on 3 legs before collapsing in exhaustion. A wolf that could not run, could not hunt. A wolf that could not hunt was already dead in the taiga. Margaret's anxiety began to mount, compounded by a more immediate crisis. The indoor firewood supply was dangerously low. For nearly 2 weeks, she had relied on the wood stacked inside the mudroom to keep the stove burning. Now, only a few splintered logs remained. To survive, she had to reach the main woodshed, located 50 yards behind the cabin. In normal conditions, it was a simple chore. In the wake of a Siberian blizzard, with temperatures hovering at -55 degrees, it was a potentially fatal expedition. On the morning of the 14th day, the howling wind finally ceased. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. The sky cleared to a piercing, blinding blue, reflecting off a landscape transformed into a frozen, alien sea of white. Margaret bundled up, layering her thermal clothing until she could barely bend her arms. She loaded her 12-gauge shotgun and slung it over her shoulder, a habit ingrained from decades in bear country. As she opened the heavy cabin door, she had to use a snow shovel to clear a wall of hard-packed snow just to step outside. The cold hit her lungs like a physical blow, stealing her breath. She pulled her scarf tighter over her nose and mouth, her eyes watering and instantly freezing on her lashes. The trek to the woodshed was agonizing. The snow was waist-deep in places, and Margaret had to meticulously forge a trench, using her shovel to carve a path. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a stark reminder of her 74 years. When she finally reached the shed, she loaded her sled with heavy birch logs, her muscles screaming in protest. She paused to catch her breath, leaning against the wooden frame of the structure, staring out at the vast, terrifying beauty of the taiga. That was when she saw them, about 100 yards past her property line, cutting a deep, ugly scar across the pristine snow, were the unmistakable treads of 2 snowmobiles. Margaret's blood ran colder than the air. The tracks were fresh, likely made within the last few hours since the storm broke. No one casually rode snowmobiles this deep into the wilderness. The local Yakut herders used traditional sleds or stayed closer to the village. These were heavy, motorized machines. She abandoned the sled and trudged toward the tree line, her scientific mind analyzing the disturbance in the snow. The tracks didn't just pass by. They circled. They lingered near the ravine where Margaret had found Ghost. They had found the site of the broken trap, the blood in the snow, and the drag marks leading back toward Margaret's cabin, which had been only partially obscured by the final flurries of the blizzard. The poachers were actively tracking their lost prey, and a mature Siberian timber wolf pelt was worth thousands of dollars on the black market. A deep, primal dread settled in Margaret's stomach. She rushed back to the woodshed, grabbed the sled rope, and hauled the wood back to the cabin with a frantic, desperate energy. When she locked the heavy door behind her, she didn't feel safe. The sturdy log walls suddenly felt as fragile as paper. Inside, Ghost raised her massive head, her ears swiveling toward the door. The wolf's nostrils flared, picking up the adrenaline and fear radiating from Margaret. For the first time since she was brought inside, Ghost let out a low, menacing growl that wasn't directed at the old woman, but at the world outside the wooden door. She knew, with the unerring instinct of the wild, that the hunt was not over. The isolation of the Siberian wilderness is absolute. There was no telephone, no radio that could reach the authorities in Oymyakon, and no neighbors to call upon. Margaret was entirely alone. She spent the fading afternoon fortifying the cabin. She bolted the heavy wooden shutters over the reinforced glass windows, plunging the interior into a perpetual, firelit twilight. She meticulously cleaned her 12-gauge shotgun, loading it with heavy buckshot, and placed it on the kitchen table. Ghost seemed to understand the shifting atmosphere. The mother wolf refused to rest. Despite the agonizing pain in her shattered leg, she dragged herself off the rug and positioned her massive body directly between the front door and the wicker basket where Ash was sleeping. She sat on her haunches, a three-legged sentinel, her amber eyes locked unblinkingly on the oak door. The sun set rapidly, plunging the tiger into an abyssal darkness as the temperature plummeted to -62. At 8 o'clock, the silence was shattered by the distinct, mechanical whine of engines approaching. Margaret stiffened. Ghost rose to her feet, the fur along her spine bristling into a stiff ridge. A terrifying, deep-chested snarl began to vibrate in the wolf's throat. The engines cut off outside. Heavy boots crunched onto the porch. Bang! 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 "Hello in there!" a gruff voice shouted. "Open up! Name's Caleb. My partner Wyatt and I got turned around. Our machines are freezing up. We just need to warm up, ma'am." It was a lie. They wouldn't sound so casual if it were true. "The nearest settlement is 20 miles east," Margaret yelled back, picking up her shotgun. "I am armed, and I will not open this door." A heavy silence fell. Then Wyatt spoke, his tone lower and menacing. "Listen here, lady. We lost a very expensive piece of property in that ravine out back. A trap. We followed a blood trail right up to your woodshed. We just want our property. Hand over the pelt, and we'll be on our way." "There is no pelt here," Margaret shouted. "We're coming in," Wyatt snarled. The heavy oak door suddenly shuddered under a massive impact. A second brutal kick shattered the lock entirely. The door flew open, letting in a swirling blast of blinding snow. Two massive men stood in the doorway. Wyatt stepped over the threshold, a hunting rifle raised. "Put the gun down, Grandma," Wyatt sneered. Before Margaret could react, Wyatt lunged forward with terrifying speed. He swung the heavy wooden stock of his rifle, striking Margaret's shotgun and violently wrenching it from her hands. He shoved her hard in the chest. Margaret stumbled backward, her boots catching the rug, and fell hard. Her head cracked agonizingly against the corner of the heavy wooden dining table. The room spun wildly. She lay gasping on the floor, tasting copper, unable to command her limbs to move. "Look at this," Caleb said, pointing toward the stove with greedy awe. Wyatt turned. Standing in the center of the room, positioned between the fallen woman and her cub, was Ghost. The 90-pound apex predator was a terrifying vision of primal fury. Her lips peeled back to expose stained, lethal fangs. "Looks like she survived," Wyatt chuckled nervously, raising his rifle. "The boss will pay double for alive." He never finished the sentence. Driven by the ultimate biological imperative to protect her young and the woman who had saved them, Ghost launched herself forward. Powered purely by her front legs and sheer willpower, she slammed into Wyatt's chest like a freight train before he could pull the trigger. The hunting rifle discharged harmlessly into the ceiling. Wyatt screamed as the wolf drove him backward out the open doorway and onto the snowy porch. Ghost's powerful jaws snapped shut over Wyatt's thick, fur-lined forearm. The sound of tearing leather and the sickening crunch of bone echoed over the howling wind. Ghost pinned him to the floorboards, her jaws shifting rapidly toward his throat, asserting total, lethal dominance. Caleb completely lost his nerve. He dropped his gear, turned, and sprinted through the deep snow toward the snowmobiles, abandoning his partner. "Call her off!" Wyatt screamed, weeping in terror, shielding his face from Ghost's snapping jaws. Fighting through the dizziness, Margaret managed to push herself up. She grabbed her fallen shotgun and pumped the action. "Ghost! Enough!" Margaret shouted. Her voice echoed with commanding authority. Miraculously, the wolf froze. She stopped thrashing and looked back at Margaret, blood dripping from her muzzle. "Get up," Margaret ordered Wyatt, limping toward the doorway, the shotgun leveled at his head. "If you ever come back, I will let her finish it. Now run." Ghost backed away slowly. Wyatt scrambled backward, clutching his broken arm, and stumbled off the porch. Within minutes, the roar of the machines faded into the vast, snowy darkness. Ghost limped to Margaret's side, leaning heavily against the old woman's leg. Margaret dropped to her knees in the snow, wrapping her arms around the wolf's thick neck, crying tears of relief. Ghost simply stood there, gently licking the blood from Margaret's forehead. Months later, The brutal Siberian winter finally broke. Ghost's leg had healed, but the damage was permanent. She walked with a heavy limp. Returning to the wild was a death sentence. But Ghost didn't leave. When Margaret opened the cabin door on the first warm morning of June, Ghost stepped out onto the porch, lying in a patch of sunlight. Ash, now a lanky adolescent, bounded into the meadow. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, sipping tea. The isolation of Oymyakon no longer felt lonely. She had saved a life, and the wild had given her a family. The Siberian tiger remains an unforgiving, indifferent expanse of ice and silence. Yet, within its frozen heart, a profound exception exists. Margaret, Ghost, and Ash forged an impossible alliance, proving that empathy can transcend the most primal divides. They walk the snowy tree line together, a widow, a crippled apex predator, and a thriving wolf bound by shared survival, living a quiet, beautiful miracle at the end of the world.